Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY. In this episode I'll be making a bowl from a section of walnut log with a segmented top and base, casting 3 colour epoxy resin. This one turned out really nice, so without further ado, let's get into it. The piece of walnut needed a clean to remove the loose bark and dried dirt. For this I used a brass wheel in the drill. It's important to do this to get a good bond between the wood and epoxy. And after drilling a hole to locate the blank on a jig, it was over to the bandsaw to cut it to round. The jig is set up to cut the blank so it fits in the casting mould. Getting it perfectly round isn't essential, so I make a series of straight cuts before finally turning it through the blade. There we go, a perfect fit. With that done, it was on to the resin casting. And I'm happy to announce this episode is sponsored by T-Expert, who provide high quality epoxy resin craft products. They recently contacted me and asked if I'd be interested in trying out some of their epoxy resin, and of course I agreed. So for full disclosure, the products you see here have been supplied free of charge in exchange for this review. I asked for a gallon of their 2-part epoxy resin, which consists of 1 bottle of part A and 1 bottle of part B, to be mixed at a 1:1 ratio, 2 pairs of neoprene gloves, a spreader, 2 plastic stirrers and a thin protective sheet, along with some info. And I also wanted to try out their UV activated fast set resin, so they sent one of those as well. Fast cure resin interested me as it could be a good superglue alternative for those pesky void and crack repairs. That's if I get any with this new product, but more on that later. So on to the mixing. I added 225 grams of part A, then 225 grams of part B to each mixing cup. I decided 3 batches would be enough for this casting. Chosen colours for this project were purple, silver black and gold. I added around a teaspoon of colourant to each batch and thoroughly mixed each one. As soon as I started mixing, I noticed that this was a much thicker consistency than I'm used to, so I had to keep a firm hold on the mixing cup. But apart from that, it all went very well. With all 3 done, I put them to one side and let them pre-cure before adding them to the casting. I didn't record the pre-curing, but the purple was heating up much quicker than the other 2, so I had to start the pour. The purple had already started to gel another 30 seconds and it would have been too late. As it was, I only just rescued it. With the first batch in the casting, I tried to break it up, but it wasn't having it. So I poured the silver black and the gold. The key here was to get it in the pressure pot as soon as possible. Something I'd like to point out is that this was in no way the fault of the resin. This was all on me. I used my previous experience to gauge when it would be the correct time to pour, and I got it wrong. But next time I'll know. It's like I've said before, I'll make the mistakes so you don't have to. And if you're wondering what the peak temp was, I couldn't tell you, except that the purple was closest to the heater. It's the next day, and to be honest, I didn't know what to expect. Would it be okay, or full of cracks and voids because I left it too long? With it out of the pot, first impressions looked good, and with it free of the casting bucket, it looked even better. The colour separation was on point, and there wasn't a single blemish to be seen. I was very happy. Main casting done, next I moved on to making the segmented base and top. For this I used walnut. This was cut down to size on the bandsaw. The dimensions I wanted was around 25 by 50 millimeters. I only had short lengths of timber, so I had a lot of fiddly cutting to do. had to cut all the segments. Each ring would have 18 segments, and the base and top would each have 2 segmented rings. The walnut cut surprisingly well, so good that every cut was perfectly clean, so no sanding needed. The segments vary in size depending on the diameter of the ring. I used to draw them out in CAD to work out the sizing, but now I have a chart that gives me all the sizes I could possibly need. Moving on, next I assembled the rings. As in my previous projects, this is done with a 3D printed template. This creates 2mm joints between each segment, which will be filled with the coloured epoxy resin. The segments are loosely arranged in the template, then an elastic band is added to hold them in place. Then another 3D printed part that has small 2mm high pins on a plastic ring is pushed into the joints and super glued in place. And with the second ring done and the template removed, the 2 rings are pressed together and super glued in place. The pieces of mixing sticks are there to maintain an even gap between the 2 rings. The 2 white semicircles which I would normally use were too big. Off camera, I'd applied super glue to the top ring, so it was just a case of aligning the joints and pressing the 2 pieces together. It was then put in a silicone mould and the base was ready for casting. The top section was assembled in just the same way, the only difference being the rings were bigger. And take note that the spacer rings are very close to the inner diameter. This is done on purpose, as the inner section will be completely removed in the turning process. I mixed 3 batches of epoxy resin with silver black mica powder. No need to let these pre-cure, so I poured them straight into the moulds. With this epoxy resin being thicker, I had to let it settle before topping each mould up, but on the plus side, I was hoping the timber wouldn't soak it up. After making sure the castings were full, I added some weight and put them both in the pressure pot to cure for 24 hours. It's the next day, the castings have cured and it's a complete success. No cracks or voids to be seen anywhere. I'm loving this new epoxy resin. Up next, the drum sander. I use this to flatten the base in the top section. I also wanted to expose the segmented rings ready for gluing to the main midsection blank. I'm not going to show too much of this, but I will tell you that I have an 80 grit loading on the drum, the feed is around 1.2 meters a minute, it's removing around 0.75 millimeters per pass, and my dust extractor is running flat out. that done, I could move on to the lathe to work on the midsection. I fixed the blank in the coal jaws using the tailstock to pin it in place. It was a bit unbalanced, so I started at around 600 RPM using the full-size carbide cutter to begin removing the waste material. Once the side was to round and the walnut blank was just starting to show, I moved on to the top of the blank. The aim here was to flatten and level the surface and remove the protruding waste block, ready for the rim to be glued on. Having got the resin level, I set about removing the waste block. Using a series of push cuts, I gradually whittled it down until it broke off. The coal jaws seemed to have a good grip, so I gently shear scraped the last little bit, and just as I thought I'd done, the gouge dug in, ripping the blank off the faceplate. It then spun up my arm, hitting me on the shoulder before smashing into the floor. Luckily there wasn't any damage to the blank, and after a quick check I decided the top was level enough, so I refixed the blank on the lathe so I could level the base. Levelling the base didn't present any problems, and after a last few passes with a skew, it was done and ready for the lower segmented blank to be glued on. To fix the two pieces together, I mixed some rapid setting epoxy resin with black mica powder. This was spread evenly over the segmented blank, which was then smushed into place using a tailstock to apply the required pressure. This was left to cure for 30 minutes. It's half an hour later and I could begin roughly shaping the base and blending it into the midsection. I began with a full-size carbide, removing the excess resin covering the segments. Having fully exposed the segments, I set about forming the pedestal. For this I used the 1/2-inch bowl gouge to cut away the waste material. The gouge could only go so far to complete the cutout, and to form a sharp transition between the upper and lower cut, I switched to the 1/2-inch detail spindle gouge. At this point I made a slight error. I took too much off the lower segmented ring, so to correct this I had to cut deeper on the upper ring, so the transition landed on the joint in between the two. see the shape I was aiming for with the midsection sloping in towards the cutout. So happy with the profile, I moved on to cut the mortise in the base. I cut the mortise in the usual way. First I cut the recess with a parting tool, then I cleaned away the inner material with a bowl gouge. Next I cut the dovetail with a dovetail cutter, finally finishing it off with a skew. Then I sanded just the underside from 80 to 800 grit and added a wax finish. I used the tailstock to centre the chuck and tightened it up. Then I refixed the workpiece to the lathe and began working on the upper section where the coal jaws had been. It didn't take much, a few swipes with a gouge, the negative rate scraper and a bit of sanding, and it was ready to have the rim section glued in place. The rim was glued on in the same way as the base. I used rapid setting epoxy mixed with black mica powder. This was spread around the outer edge of the main blank, then this was placed on top of the rim, remembering to align the joints with the base. And 30 minutes later, the epoxy had cured. So with a blank refixed to the lathe, I set about uncovering the segments in the rim. For this I used the full-size carbide, fitted with a negative rate scraper. With most of the segments exposed, I switched to the 1/2 inch bowl gouge, shear scraping the lower ring into the top ring to form an undercut. After a bit of work from the full-size carbide, I switched to the small negative rate scraper to blend the sweeping undercut into the resin and walnut midsection. As I said earlier, I was happy with the general profile sloping down into the cutout, but there was still a bit of resin covering one end of the walnut flank, so I used a very sharp scraper to cut it away. This caused a narrowing of the diameter between the rim and the midsection. I switched to the large negative rate scraper to blend this down into the cutout, and this is where I lost a lot of the shape. That done, on closer inspection I could feel one area of the walnut was quite punky. This was a great opportunity to try out the T-Expert UV resin. I liberally applied a layer over the affected spot, then taking a small UV light, I activated the resin. I filled a couple of other spots, and 20 minutes later, it was done. The outer surface was more or less done, so I moved on to hollowing out. The first thing to get rid of was the MDF waste block. I cut through most of it with a parting tool, then used a full-size carbide to cut away the waste resin surrounding it. Keen to get it gone, I had a go with a gouge, but I got a catch, which very nearly saw the blank flying off the lathe again, but luckily it stayed in place, and I quickly had it re-tightened back on the chuck. I now had clear access to the interior of the bowl. Using various tools, I set about removing the waste. The full-size carbide was best at removing the resin. The gouge came into its own on the walnut segments, and the mix of materials lower down were best removed with a side cutting scraper and the standard carbide cutters. I also had a new tool to try. This is the Simon Hope medium hook tool. It's mainly for doing hollow forms, but on this it was great, though the shape limited how much I could use it. Finally, I reached the base of the bowl. With most of the weight gone, I could cut away the centre support. I tried with a gouge, but I couldn't get a good angle, so the carbide took care of it. Using carbide and scrapers, I cleaned up the inner surface. The spot of purple resin in the base is where I drilled the hole for the jig on the bandsaw. There was one final repair for the UV resin. This time I mixed in a bit of fine sawdust, applied the UV light, and after 20 minutes I used a scraper to blend it in and fair the inner surface. Inside done, I had a final bit of shaping to do on the rim. I deliberately left this till the end. I wasn't sure how much I would need to take off the top, and I wanted the thickness of the edge of the rim to match the edge of the base. A final go with a scraper and it was done. I sanded from 80 to 3000 grit, then I cleaned down, inside and out, with denatured alcohol. Then I applied 2 liberal coats of sanding sealer, each one de-nibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Next up, Yorkshire grit. Just 1 coat, thoroughly cleaned away till no more residue picks up on the paper towel. Then the resin polishing. First, Mercopolar Shine 10, a single application, thoroughly cleaned away, ready for the next stage. Quickly followed by Polar Shine 5, another single application, polished off to leave a deep shine. And to finish, Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax. 2 coats, buffed to seal and protect the surface. And that's it, another project finished, and this one could be my new favourite. The colour separation in the resin is perfect. The 3 colours combined with the walnut is just right, and the shape turned out nicely as well. So with all that said, I'd like to thank T-Expert for sponsoring this episode. I can definitely recommend their epoxy resin products. You'll find links to the things I used and a 10% discount code in the video description. I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. A thumbs up will be much appreciated, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.